I've been on Kestra 6 for nearly 4 years, which felt like a lifetime in a place where metal could freeze solid overnight and storms howled so loudly they drowned out every thought. I had come here to escape, or more accurately, to hide from the parts of myself I could no longer bear. In the beginning, the silence was a welcome reprieve. No one asked me questions. No one expected anything. The habitation dome was battered and half-buried in snowdrifts most of the year, and the meager supplies delivered by unmanned cargo drops were barely enough to keep me going. But I prefer it that way. If I had to describe the climate of Kestra 6 in a single word, it would be brutal. Temperatures sank so low that stepping outside unprotected for more than a minute could freeze your lungs. People, at least those who used to live here, called this moon the place where exiles go to die in quiet. And that was exactly why I accepted the post. I want to no more noise, no more heartbreak, no more illusions of belonging somewhere I had failed to protect the one person I loved most. It was late one evening when the biggest storm of the season rolled in. I heard at first a distant shriek in the canyons, then a roar that bent the dome's exterior plating, screeching against the bolts. The generator was old and complained as the wind slammed into the structure, but I kept it going with every ounce of mechanical skill I had. My bones felt the chill, even under layers of synthetic insulation. Around midnight, the outer sensors gave their usual false alarms. Chunks of ice, swirling drifts, maybe a wind-blown scrap of metal from the old research outpost. By now, I had learned to ignore the random pings. If the dome was going to fail, it would simply fail, and I would vanish beneath the drifts. I had accepted that possibility a long time ago. But that night, the sensor pinged multiple times in a pattern that made me uneasy. Short bursts, then a sustained signal, then nothing. I glanced at the readout. It flickered, showing me a faint shape near the southern arc, close to where the auxiliary intake vents were buried. I almost ignored it. At first, I told myself it was just the weather. Then I noticed the shape was still there, an outline that hadn't moved, even with the wind gusting at 70 miles an hour. I cursed under my breath, considered leaving it be, and then found myself pulling on my insulated gear. I couldn't explain it, just a sense that ignoring it would be a mistake I couldn't stomach. I wrestled with the outer airlock, letting the storm burst in, biting my cheeks with shards of ice. Visibility was near zero. Snow whirled in a dizzying dance of white. The flashlights built into my suit did almost nothing except reflect off the swirling snowflakes. I kept close to the dome, moving by memory, stepping carefully. My breath came in sharp, jagged gulps. The cold reached inside me, a punishing force that made my muscles seize. After what felt like hours, I reached the southern side where a low drift had piled. I saw something dark protruding from the snow, shaped like an arm. My mind stuttered. It looked human, yet I knew it couldn't be. No one would survive these storms. Even I barely managed, and I had the dome for shelter. Adrenaline cut through the cold as I dropped to my knees and brushed snow away. My gloves scraped over frost-laced fabric and something that felt like skin. A face emerged, a face both human-like and strange, with angular features, pale blue skin that shimmered faintly, and white hair crusted in ice. Her lips were cracked, tinted the same faint blue, her breathing so shallow I nearly thought she was gone. I felt my heart slam in my chest in a way it hadn't in years. The last time I felt that kind of panic was when Iris was sealed behind a pressure door and I couldn't save her. I refused to let that happen again. I shed my coat, wrapped it around this mysterious figure, and carefully lifted her from the snow. She was light, distressingly so, and her limbs were cold as death. Just as I turned, I felt her fingers twitch, then close around the cuff of my coat. I looked down. Her eyes flickered open for less than a heartbeat, revealing an amber glow that made me stop breathing. Then they slid shut again, and she sagged in my arms. Fighting the wind, I dragged her back to the airlock. Each step felt like wading through knives. Ice coated my visor. My legs burned from exertion. By the time I sealed us both inside, I was shaking uncontrollably. Warm air hissed in, but the corridor was still frigid. I sank to my knees, rolling her onto the floor, checking her pulse in a frantic rush. She was alive, though barely. I started stripping off her frozen, tattered garments. They were hardly protective, some kind of patchwork made from random materials, none in good condition. The second layer looked like a thermal wrap that had lost its heating filament. I cursed softly. How had she lasted this long out there? My dome was old, but the heating vent in the main chamber was functional. I carried her inside and laid her down near the vent, cranking the heat as high as I could without overloading the system. Ice melted on her skin, sending rivulets of water dripping onto the floor. I brought out blankets, layering them over her still form, trying to be gentle yet quick. Her breathing hitched, then steadied into a shallow, rasping rhythm. I could scarcely tear my eyes away from her. That face, both undeniably alien and strangely beautiful. I had no protocol for this. Central Command's official stance said to report any first contact situation immediately. But I couldn't bear the thought of them snatching her away, dissecting her, locking her in some lab. Maybe I was a fool, but I couldn't do it. So I shut off the comms. Let them think the storm knocked me offline. She didn't wake for hours. I sat by the heater, watching her chest rise and fall, half convinced she wouldn't survive the night. Eventually, exhaustion took me, and I dozed in a chair, a blanket draped over my shoulders. When I woke, the lighting system indicated it was mid-morning, though that meant little on Kestra 6. Outside, the wind still shrieked, but the dome held. I crouched next to her, pressing a hand to her forehead, colder than a human's, but not as icy as before. Feeling half delirious, I prepared a ration of protein paste, just in case she came around. Then she stirred. It was barely a movement. Her fingers flexed, and her eyelids fluttered. I leaned over, heart pounding. Slowly, she pushed herself up onto one elbow, the blankets sliding off her shoulders. Her gaze swept across the dome, stopping when she saw me. For a second, I saw fear and confusion twist together, but they softened into something else, a raw, urgent hunger. Her eyes locked onto the sealed food packs stacked behind me, and I realized she was starving. I reached for one, tore it open with unsteady hands, and offered it to her. She snatched it, practically inhaled the paste, not even chewing. I never seen someone so desperate to eat. I opened another, and then another. By the time she finished the third, her trembling had eased. She looked at me, then at the heater, then back at me. I cleared my throat, hoping to sound calm. "I'm Stu," I said, tapping my chest. "Stu." She blinked, her gaze flicking down on my hand and then back up to my face. Her voice was soft, rough with dehydration, but the way she repeated my name was a mere mimicry. "Stu." She let the consonants roll on her tongue, as though tasting them. Something stirred in my chest that I hadn't felt in years, an odd warmth that wasn't from the heater. Slowly, I pointed to her. "And you?" She looked away, a hint of sadness crossing her features. Her fingers moved to a torn strip of fabric on her old thermal wrap, where alien symbols were etched. Then she shook her head. "No name," she said, voice halting. It wasn't that she refused. Rather, it was as though she never had one. I swallowed. "We'll figure something out," I promised. Over the next few days, the storm's fury lessened. My unexpected guest slept in fits, sometimes murmuring phrases in a language I'd never heard. Whenever she woke, I offered her water, rations, and as much warmth as the dome could provide. She ate ravenously, every muscle taut with survival instincts. Slowly, though, she began to relax in my presence. She followed my movements with curious eyes, absorbing everything from how I prepared a meal to how I checked the heating vents. Her comprehension of my speech skyrocketed. I suspected some kind of advanced technology was helping her learn, but I couldn't see any device. Maybe it was purely her intellect. One night, as I was cleaning out a clogged filter, she surprised me by saying, "You fix things." The sentence was broken, but understandable. I nearly dropped my wrench. "Yeah," I replied. "I try." She tilted her head. "Teach me," she said. So I did. I showed her the console, how to read basic sensors, how to flush the vents. She mirrored every gesture with uncanny precision. then repeated my instructions back in near-perfect English. My suspicion about a translator device grew stronger, but I kept it to myself. She was learning so quickly that it bordered on the impossible. Still, my priority was keeping her hidden. I powered down the external cameras, masked any heat signatures that might catch the attention of passing drones. Officially, my dome was considered low priority and rarely checked, but if she had been out there, someone might be searching for her. I asked her once, "Is someone chasing you?" She just looked away, pressing her lips together. A day later, she finally told me in halting English that she had run from something she called reassignment. The details were vague, but it sounded like a forced procedure that would wipe her mind. The next morning, she confided that her species was grown, not born, each individual assigned a number. She was called C5A in that system. Her entire existence had been built around observation, infiltration, and emotionless data collection, until she encountered humans and started to feel. That had made her defective, and defects were either reset or destroyed. I began to understand the kind of hell she'd crawled through. She said nothing about how she ended up on Kestra 6, but I guessed it was an escape gone awry, a crash landing, a final desperate walk through sub-zero wastelands until she collapsed at my airlock. The more she spoke, the more her voice settled into a recognizable pattern, each word chosen carefully. I couldn't help noticing that her posture changed whenever we talked about her past. She would pull her knees to her chest, eyes distant. I told her about my past, too. About Iris, a civilian technician who was denied access to an evacuation transport when a containment breach occurred on Maris 4. She hadn't been on the priority list, and the doors locked before I could save her. I'd volunteered for remote duty after that, ashamed of my inaction and bitter at the system that decided who lived and who died. We understood each other's ghosts, even if we didn't put it that way. If I was no longer alone, neither was she. That realization both scared me and gave me hope. Late one evening, she touched my arm, looking at me with those amber eyes. "I feel safe," she said in a voice so fragile I almost thought I'd imagined it. She tested the word safe, as if it was foreign and profound. Something stirred in my chest, tight and overwhelming. I simply nodded, not trusting my voice. A few days later, I was teaching her to check the power distribution readouts when the console flashed. External sensor triggered. My stomach lurched. I quickly killed the feed, hoping the spike hadn't been transmitted anywhere. She asked quietly, "They come?" I bit my lip. "Not sure, but I'm not taking chances." We spent that night huddled with the lights dimmed, the dome so silent we could hear our own breathing. Outside, the wind raged, but inside, there was an intimacy in that hush. We said very little, but I felt her presence like a solid, comforting weight against my side. Twice, she dozed off with her head on my shoulder. Each time, I fought the urge to hold her, still unsure of our boundaries. Eventually, she stirred and whispered, "You can hold me." So I did, pulling her gently into my arms, feeling the soft warmth of her breath against my neck. In that single moment, it felt as though the ice under my heart began to melt. When the storm finally relented, I needed to step outside to clear the snowdrifts from the generator intake. She insisted on coming with me. I worried about her resilience, but she just shook her head firmly. "I'm strong," she said. Even if she'd nearly died in the cold once, she had no desire to hide away. Together, we exited the dome. A pale sun lingered behind thick clouds, giving off one light that turned the snow a dull silver. We trudged through knee-deep drifts to knock the ice buildup loose. She followed my instructions with steady competence, using a handheld heater to melt what she couldn't break. I found myself watching her more than I should, admiring how she adapted so quickly to everything, including the brutal environment of Kestra 6. We returned inside with fresh bruises, numb fingers, and something else, a shared sense of accomplishment. I prepared 2 steaming ration packs, which we ate cross-legged on the floor, shoulders touching. She turned the empty pouch over in her hands, studying the instructions. Then she spoke softly, "I have no name." She paused, letting the words settle. "But I want one. Like you." I felt my heart pound against my ribs. Giving her a name felt like a responsibility, a commitment. After a moment, I said, "Let's think of one that fits who you are now, not who they forced you to be." She considered that. For a while, neither of us spoke. Eventually, she nodded, pressing her lips together. I didn't yet know which name she'd choose, but from the look in her eyes, I sensed she would find it soon. Time passed in an odd blur of small tasks, hushed conversations, and the unspoken tension that someone might be hunting her. Some nights, we would hear faint static over the old comms array, but we kept everything powered down. We moved carefully, venturing outside only to maintain the dome. I caught glimpses of how formidable she could be. She learned to rewire conduits faster than me, discovered ways to seal cracks in the dome's plating that I'd never noticed. She was more than a survivor. She was brilliant. One evening, while rechecking the dome's sensor system, she showed me a piece of damaged technology, a circular metal disc the size of my palm with hairline fractures across its surface. "Cognition weave," she said softly. "Broken, but it helped me learn your language." I examined the faint pulses of red light inside, amazed it still functioned. She explained that her species used these devices to acquire languages and blend into foreign cultures. The thought made me uneasy, but I also recognized it was the reason she could speak to me so well. She put the device away and looked at me with a strange mixture of vulnerability and resolve. "I was built to watch, not to feel. But humans, you changed me." I wanted to say something comforting, but I couldn't find the right words. Instead, I tentatively placed a hand on her shoulder. She leaned into me. That was enough of an answer. The lines dividing us, human and alien, blurred into something that no longer mattered. We understood pain, loneliness, the longing for a place to belong. That was universal. After a week or so, we detected a scouting drone on the horizon. The sensor log showed a small craft dropping from orbit, circling the region as if scanning for a heat signature or radio signal. I cursed under my breath. So did she, in her own soft language. We hunkered down, cut all non-essential power, even turned off the generator for a few minutes at a time, relying on battery heat. "They're searching for me," she whispered in the dark. "I know they are." I placed my hand on hers, feeling her fingers tighten. "They won't find you," I said. "Not if we work together." Still, we knew this was only a temporary reprieve. The next day, while looking at the swirling readouts on the console, she said, "We can lure them away. Create a false signal." She pointed to an abandoned relay tower about a kilometer east, half collapsed under the ice. If we rigged a heat generator there, we might trick the drone's sensors into scanning that location. It was risky. We'd have to cross open ground in freezing conditions and set up a decoy that broadcast for just long enough. But we agreed we had no choice. We set off just before dusk. The cold was savage. Even layered in suits and gear, every breath felt like shards of glass cutting my throat. She walked at my side, posture determined, scanning the horizon for any sign of movement. The snow reflected the weak twilight, painting our surroundings in ghostly blue. After an hour, we spotted the half-buried relay tower. Iron beams jutted from the ground at odd angles, the remains of a communications array that had collapsed long ago. We had to climb over twisted metal to reach the central console, where we could install the small transponder that would mimic our dome's heat signature. As she crouched to attach the device, I kept watch. My pulse was a drumbeat in my ears. The slightest flicker of movement made my heart leap. When she finished, she set a time trigger. "We have 5 minutes before it starts emitting," she said, breath fogging in the frigid air. "Then we run." We did. The wind had begun to pick up, driving icy crystals against our visors. Halfway back, the swirling gusts nearly knocked me off my feet. She grabbed my arm, steadying me. There, in the middle of that frozen wasteland, she pulled me close. Our suits clanked together, and I saw fear in her eyes. Not fear of the cold, but fear that we might be separated. One more tragic story lost to Kestra 6. I squeezed her hand. "We're going to make it," I mouthed. She nodded, and we pressed on. By the time we stumbled into the dome, the decoy was already active. The console's external readout flickered, indicating a strong heat spike at the relay tower's coordinates. I watched the data nervously. Sure enough, the orbiting drone changed course. A slow smile tugged at my mouth, but I didn't relax. We bought ourselves time, no more. She closed the hatch behind us and ripped off her gloves, rubbing her hands near the heater. I did the same. Our eyes met, and something snapped between us, a tension we'd both carried like a weight. She reached for me. I stepped forward. We fell into each other with a clumsy desperation, suits still half-fastened. Her lips were cold, but tasted like the only living warmth on this dead moon. I hadn't kissed anyone since Iris. I thought I'd forgotten how. But in that moment, everything else vanished, replaced by a need to hold and be held. When we finally broke apart, I rested my forehead against hers, breath ragged. She cupped my cheeks with trembling fingers. "I don't want to run anymore," she whispered. Her voice cracked. "I'm tired of being a shadow." My chest tightened painfully. "You don't have to," I promised. "We'll figure this out. Together." She stared at me with those luminous amber eyes, then nodded. That night, we stayed awake, huddled in the corner of the dome, talking in hushed voices. She told me more about her creation, about how her kind was bred for infiltration. They all had a number, a rank that determined their function. She started feeling empathy while observing humans on another world. That was a flaw. They recalled her for reconditioning. She fled, sabotaged a transport, and ended up crashing on Kestra 6. "I'd rather die in the cold than let them erase me," she said. Her words shook me. I felt a surge of protectiveness, the same helpless rage I felt when Iris died. But this time, I wouldn't be powerless. "You won't die," I said, gripping her hand. "Not here, not now." Days bled into nights as we planned our next steps. I upgraded the dome's security protocols, rigged the sensors to mask life signs. She helped me rewire the solar array for better power reserves, teaching me a few surprising tricks. Whenever I asked how she knew these things, she'd just smile faintly and tap the pocket where she kept the cognition weave disk. She was far more than a creation built to observe. She was her own person now. In the quiet moments, we shared small intimacies, a brush of hands, a murmured joke, an awkward dance around the cramped living space when the generator hummed louder than usual. Our closeness felt fragile, but it was real. Finally, the console alerted us again. The drone had returned to low orbit, scanning systematically. We realized it was only a matter of time before they'd pinpoint the dome. She looked at me with grim determination. "We can't hide forever." "No," I agreed, "but we can force them to think we're not worth chasing." We discussed sabotage, forging data logs that indicated she died or that she'd escaped off-world. Her eyes lit with a fierce resolve. "Yes," she said, "let's show them they lost me." We traveled to an old satellite station about a kilometer north. The trek was brutal, but less dangerous than the first time, since the storm had quieted. The station was essentially a metal husk with a half-functioning array. Together, we rewrote code to send out false signals, forging a record of a life pod launch. If it worked, any scanning vessel might assume she departed. Still, we knew it wouldn't be foolproof. And if they sent ground troops to investigate, we'd have a fight on our hands. While she tested the final lines of code, I watched her from across the dusty console. There was a new steadiness in her movements, a certainty in how she held herself. Her hair, once matted with ice, now flowed down her back in a white curtain, caught in a simple tie I'd improvised. Her skin still had that faint blue hue, but it looked healthier, no longer marred by frostbite. When she glanced up, meeting my eyes, she smiled in a way that made my chest ache. I realized she'd become the reason I wanted to live. We activated the forge data. The station hissed to life, sending signals up into the gray sky. Then we powered down, letting the place fall silent again. On our way back, she stumbled against a loose patch of ice, and I caught her. We ended up pressed close, breathing hard. Without speaking, we kissed again, the air cold around us but our lips warm. I cradled the back of her head, felt the softness of her hair, marveled at the sheer miracle of finding someone in a place like this. When we finally returned to the dome, our rations were almost depleted. I heated the last packet of synth eggs, and we shared it. "We'll have to rely on the next cargo drop," I said, trying not to sound anxious. She nodded, resting against me. "I'll help," she said. "We can hunt." I laughed softly. "On Kestra 6? There's nothing to hunt except IceWYRMS. And trust me, that's not something you want to wrestle with." Her eyes flicked up, curiosity piqued. IceWYRMS. I sighed. A rumor, mostly. The scientists insisted no large fauna could survive here, but some swear they've seen serpentine shapes beneath the glaciers. She looked thoughtful. "Stranger things have happened," she mused, and I couldn't deny it. As we settled for the night, she touched the small disc in her pocket. Her voice wavered. "I've been thinking. I need a name that belongs to me, not to them." I waited. She glanced at me, lips parted. "Is Asha a human name?" I blinked. "In some languages, it means hope." She repeated the word softly. "Asha," and her voice trembled. "I like that. May I?" "It's yours," I said gently, reaching out to squeeze her hand. She exhaled, relief and determination mingling on her face. "Then that's who I am. Asha." In that moment, it felt like she'd crossed an invisible threshold, stepping out of the shadow of her past. I leaned close and whispered, "Welcome to yourself, Asha." Time became fluid after that. We spent hours refining the dome's defenses, monitoring the orbiting ship that still hovered in scanning range. I taught Asha everything I knew about the mechanical systems, and she taught me how to see the world through new eyes, someone who was, in a sense, newly born into her own identity. We laughed at our missteps, held each other through nightmares. I told her about Iris in detail one night, how the guilt had almost crushed me, how I believed I'd never save anyone again. She looked at me with quiet understanding. "You've already saved someone," she said, fingers drifting over my cheek. Her words undid me. I had to press my forehead to hers to hide the tears. "I guess we save each other," I managed to say. We lived that way, half anxious, half hopeful, until the day the console alerted us to a new signal. A small craft had detached from the main vessel in orbit and was descending to the surface. We tracked it in tense silence as it landed about 2 kilometers from us. Asha and I exchanged a look. "They know I'm here," she said. "Or they suspect." We had 2 choices, hide in the dome or go on the offensive. Asha inhaled slowly. "I'm tired of running," she said, setting her jaw. "If they come, I want to fight for my life." A surge of protectiveness coursed through me, but I forced myself to stay rational. "You're sure?" "Yes," she whispered. "No more shadows." We packed what little gear we had, a makeshift fusion torch, a set of small charges, and a battered rifle I'd salvaged from the old base. Then we ventured out onto the ice. The temperature was lethal, but we'd grown used to it. We cut a wide arc around the landing site. I caught glimpses of a sleek, dark shuttle partially veiled by blowing snow. We could see silhouettes moving near its hull, maybe 3 or 4 figures in dark environmental suits. My gut clenched. Asha exhaled. "They won't leave until they find me." I gritted my teeth. Let's give them something else to find. We circled to a vantage point along an ice ridge. Asha's breath came in steady clouds as she studied the figures. "They have scanning devices. If I get close, they'll detect my biosignature." I nodded, rummaging in my pack for the charges. "I'll distract them," I said. "You flank from behind." For a moment, she stared at me, eyes wide with an emotion I couldn't name. Then she nodded. "Don't get yourself killed," she whispered. I forced a wry smile. "I'll do my best." I crept forward, my heart thudding painfully. For someone who once lived in quiet desperation, I never imagined I'd voluntarily risk my life like this. But Asha was behind me, and that changed everything. I tossed a small charge onto a chunk of metal debris. The beep was muffled by the wind. Then I scrambled away, counting down in my head. A flicker of light, a burst of noise. The charge exploded with a deafening crack. Immediately, I heard shouts from the figures by the shuttle. They fanned out, searching the swirling snow. I launched 2 more charges in quick succession, forcing them to split up. My intention was never to kill them, just to scatter them. Through the haze, I glimpsed one figure turning in my direction, lifting a weapon. My stomach clenched. Before they could fire, Asha emerged from behind, silent as a ghost, and struck. The figure went down, falling into the drift. In the chaos, I saw another figure sprint toward the shuttle. Asha darted after them with astonishing speed, intercepting them with a ferocity I hadn't known she possessed. Adrenaline pounded in my skull. The wind howled, carrying fragmented sounds of struggle. I rushed forward, half blind, rifle raised. By the time I reached the scuffle, Asha stood victorious, the figure slumped in the snow. Her eyes met mine, brimming with determination. We both knew we had only moments before the rest regrouped. She pointed to the shuttle's open hatch, breath billowing. "We can sabotage it, ground them." I nodded. "Let's go." We raced inside. The shuttle's interior was cramped, half-lit by flickering overhead panels. I slammed a charge onto the flight console, intending to fry its power couplings. Asha worked the controls with astonishing familiarity, gleaning enough from memory or from that advanced part of her mind that processed technology. A sudden voice behind us shouted in a language I didn't understand. I spun around. Another pursuer had cornered us, weapon raised. My stomach plunged. Asha and I stood in the partial darkness, hearts pounding. The figure barked a command, presumably telling us to drop our weapons. Asha lifted her hands slowly. I did the same. The figure stepped closer, scanning Asha's features. In that split second, I remembered Iris behind a seal-pressure door. I refused to relive that helplessness. Without warning, I lunged, swinging the butt of the rifle. The figure staggered back as Asha dove in, grabbing their arm. A shot discharged, ricocheting off the wall. I felt a white-hot line sear my arm. Then the figure crumpled under Asha's final blow, the weapon clattering to the floor. Everything felt surreal, like slow motion in the swirling gloom. My arm throbbed, but I hissed through clenched teeth, "I'm fine." Asha's eyes flickered with concern, but she finished inputting a final sequence on the console. Sparks flew as the system short-circuited. "We need to go," she gasped. We ran out, the wind hitting us like a physical wall. I glanced back. The shuttle's exterior lights flickered, then died. I heard distant shouts. Let them shout. They'd be stuck here unless they signaled for a rescue craft from orbit, but that might take time. Long enough for us to vanish. We stumbled across the ice, each step a blur of pain and cold. When we finally made it back to the dome, I collapsed against the interior wall, breathing in great ragged gulps. Asha tore off her gloves and gently checked my arm. The burn was shallow, but it stung fiercely. She cleaned it, her eyes wet with tears of relief. "You're an idiot," she whispered. "Maybe," I wheezed, "but we're alive." We tended each other's wounds in the hush that followed. Then, with the dome sealed and locked down, we realized we were trembling, hearts still hammering from the confrontation. Without a word, she pressed her forehead to mine. Her voice was thick with emotion. "Thank you for not leaving me." I closed my eyes, swallowing back the tightness in my throat. "I'll never leave you," I promised, meaning it with every fiber of my being. She kissed me then, fiercely, as though anchoring herself to the promise that we would not yield. In that kiss, all the fear, all the loneliness gave way to something else, a desperate, overpowering closeness that bound us more than any vow. For a few days after, we stayed inside, scanning for movement. The craft remained on the surface, crippled. We assumed the survivors would attempt a beacon signal, but a new storm front rolled in, possibly jamming transmissions. Asha and I embraced the reprieve, using it to finalize our exodus plan. We could fix up an older satellite station deeper in the mountains, or we could hold our ground here, fortifying the dome. "If we leave, they might follow," she said softly. "If we stay, we risk another assault." Neither option was perfect. Finally, we decided the dome was home now. We would defend it come what may. Together, we overhauled its systems, installed hidden lockouts, repurposed old panels to create barricades. In a way, it felt like we were building a fortress, but we also gave it the warmth of a real home, 2 cots side by side, bits of personal items. I placed a small photograph of Iris on the console, and Asha gave me a gentle smile when she saw it. "She'd be proud of you," Asha murmured. Maybe she was right. Throughout it all, the word family began to hover unspoken between us. Asha had said once that no one had ever touched her without wanting to claim something. We proved that wasn't true. We touched each other out of care, out of a simple desire for closeness. One evening, she asked, "When humans love, do they say it with words or with actions?" I thought about it. "Both," I said. She nodded solemnly. "I love you, Stu," she said, with that lilting accent that still colored her English. My heart almost stopped. I took her hands in mine and kissed her palms. "I love you," I breathed, "and I'm not letting you go." The tears that slipped down her cheeks glistened in the low light, and I gathered her into my arms, letting our hearts speak in the hush that followed. At some point, the orbiting ship departed, likely summoned away or convinced that the mission was a failure. The stranded crew presumably found a way off-world eventually, but they never returned to the dome. Perhaps they assumed we perished. Perhaps they reported Asha as deceased. We didn't care. We had built our future out of the wreckage. The cargo drop arrived a few weeks later, bringing fresh rations and new materials. For the first time in ages, I felt excitement at the prospect of continuing life here, not merely surviving, but living. Asha pointed at the battered nameplate by the main console, my name and a new line carved beneath it. "Asha." She winked at me, as if to say, "We belong here together." In the end, Kestra 6 remained the frozen, inhospitable moon it had always been. The storms still screamed across the plains, and the temperatures still sank low enough to snap metal. Yet inside our dome, the air was warm, kept alive by the steady hum of heaters, the faint glow of old lamps, and the quiet presence of two souls who refused to lose each other. We ate together, slept curled against each other on worn blankets, and made plans that might never come to pass, like growing a small hydroponic patch or building a second dome with a real living area. Sometimes it felt foolish to dream, but that was what made us human, or at least what made us ourselves. Asha wasn't human in the strict sense, but she had chosen a human name, a human heart, and I considered her the most profoundly alive person I'd ever met. Occasionally, we'd sit at the window, peering through the frost-laced glass into the endless white. She would rest her head on my shoulder, and I'd lace our fingers together. "Do you ever regret bringing me in that night?" she asked me once, a playful tone undercut by genuine vulnerability. I shook my head, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Never. You saved me, too." She turned her face toward me, a soft smile curving her lips. "You call me family." I never had that. I felt my chest tighten with a wave of emotion. "You do now," I promised. Our reflections in the glass glowed faintly. Two figures huddled close in the middle of A. Frozen nowhere, yet utterly alone. On nights when the storms quieted enough for the sky to clear, we'd glimpse the stars above. Asha would press her hand to the cold glass, remembering the time she spent traveling between worlds, back when she was just a watcher without a name. I'd hold her from behind, arms around her waist, feeling the slow rise and fall of her breath. We never spoke of leaving Kestra 6, not anymore. Perhaps in the future, we might. But for now, we had everything we needed right here: safety, warmth, and each other. Sometimes, if I closed my eyes, I almost heard Iris's gentle laughter, like a reminder that I was alive again, capable of love, worthy of a family. It felt like healing in the simplest sense of the word. Asha often said love was an affliction her people warned against. But it's the best kind of affliction, she once told me with a wry grin. It makes us real. I could only agree. Each day was a gift. Each shared meal, each quiet conversation, each new plan scribbled on scraps of paper was a promise that we had more than we ever thought possible in this desolate place. In time, she helped me reclaim parts of myself I thought were lost forever. She teased me until I laughed, scolded me when I forgot to rest, and held me when old nightmares returned. In turn, I gave her the affirmation that she was not defined by those who created her. She was Asha, wholly herself, a fierce and curious soul who chose to be free. We called each other family, and that word, once empty, became a lifeline, proof that home is built, not found. Outside, The storms would rage, the snows burying the tracks we left whenever we ventured out for maintenance or salvage. But inside, we had light and heat, music from a battered old audio device, laughter that broke the silence, and a sense of belonging that no force in the galaxy could tear away. If they ever came back for her, if those who once owned her number and her fate returned, I knew we would stand together side by side, defiant. She was done being a ghost in someone else's design. I was done being a broken man cowering from his past. We had found what so many die without ever knowing, a reason to face tomorrow unafraid. And so, to anyone else, the dome was just another station on a forgotten moon, battered by relentless cold, an afterthought in the grand scheme of the universe. But to us, it was home. It was the place where I opened a door one night and found a half-frozen alien woman who had no name, only a number, and it was the place where, by saving her, I discovered I could still save myself. Over time, she stopped calling me Stu and began to call me something else, a soft variation of the word family in her original language. I never could pronounce it correctly, but I understood its meaning. And every time she said it, I remembered the night I almost didn't open that door. I remembered how close I came to letting the storm take her. Had I ignored that final sensor ping, I would have missed the greatest blessing of my solitary existence. But I hadn't ignored it. I stepped outside in the cold, found her, and now she calls me family. That, in the end, was worth every risk, every drop of sweat and blood and tears shed on a frozen moon. We may have been two exiles running from different sorrows, but we found each other. And in that frozen wasteland, surrounded by screaming winds and an indifferent sky, we built a life that was truly ours. We were no longer alone, and for us, that was everything.